Greetings, everyone. I'm Larry Williams, the Director of CARMA, the Consortium for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis. And it is a nice Friday morning, March the 15th.
Yes.
And it's my pleasure to welcome you to another version of Meet the Methodologist. Meet the Methodologist is where I take the advantage of the opportunity to chat with a distinguished scholar who will be visiting CARMA in the near future to give a webcast lecture. You may know that in addition to the short courses that we offer in several locations, both within the US and globally, we also have our signature program, our webcast program, where we bring distinguished presenters on campus to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, the current home of CARMA. And today's guest will be joining us in 2 weeks there to give her webcast lecture. But today she's taken the time, a break from the normal Friday morning schedule to chat with me. So it's my pleasure to introduce Allison Gabriel. Allie got her degree in IO psychology from the University of Akron in 2013. Spent a few years at one of my former universities, Virginia Commonwealth University, before moving on to the University of Arizona. You may be aware that Allie has published substantive research in several topical areas in all the top journals, and it's that kind of publishing success that has led her to be editorial board members at a Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Business Psychology, Journal of Management, Journal of Work Behavior, and Personnel Psychology. So, but as you probably know, CARMA is about research methods, and Allie's going to be talking with us about research methods. Her research methods scholarship has appeared in the Journal of Applied Psychology and Organizational Research Methods, and has focused on topics like trying to understand within-person variance, multi-level analysis, but perhaps most notably experience sampling methods, which is the topic of her lecture in a couple of weeks. So, Allie, welcome to CARMA, and good to get the chance to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This will be fun.
Yep. So I always like, when you get to know different people, it's a lot of diversity and oftentimes a lot of interesting twists and turns that lead people to end up doing what they do. How did you end up in graduate school in IO psychology at the University of Akron?
Yeah, that's a good question, because if you had asked me what I was going to do when I was a freshman at Penn State, I probably would have told you that I was going to go to law school. And so I was thinking about this question yesterday of how I got here. And it's really funny because I wanted to go to law school because I actually distinctly remembered a time in middle school and high school where I was told by a couple of teachers that math and the like was not my strong suit, but writing was my strong suit. And so I should major in things that led to writing, and that was the main focus. And so naturally I was like, oh, well, law school, that probably would be a good place. If writing is my strong suit, I should go do that. And then what happened when I got to Penn State, I decided to major in psychology. I just thought it would be interesting, would be a nice segue maybe to law school, because I believed all of the wrong things of psych, that it would teach me how to read people and things like that, and it would make me a better lawyer. But at Penn State, they had this required first-year seminar program because all of the classes were so large. So you had to pick a seminar, and I picked a seminar in psychology called Psychology of Service with a Smile. It was taught by Alicia Grandy, and I was drawn to it because it was billed as being all about understanding customer service work, the well-being of customer service employees, the emotion management that they go through, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. This connects with these part-time jobs I've had that I've thought were really stressful, even though I thought I was a people person. And I just got kind of hooked, and I think Alicia saw it, so she pulled me into her lab spring of my freshman year at Penn State, so this would have been spring of 2009. And I stayed in her lab, and over the course of a couple of years, she kept kind of being like, are you sure you want to go to law school? Like, I think you should. apply to PhD programs in IO. I think you should apply to University of Akron. I have this colleague, Jim Diefendorf, there who I think you would get along with. And I kind of applied like almost out of humor, and we were like, okay, like I don't think any of these schools are going to let me in. And then University of Akron was the first school to admit me, and I went to their visit weekend and basically canceled all my visits after that. I met Jim and just really connected to him, how he, his advising style, his personality. And I felt like, oh, this is a really cool natural segue. And so I made the transition over to working with Jim. And that was just like a great mentor-mentee relationship. And yeah, so it probably looks very linear, but it was actually this battle I had with Alicia for a few years. I'm like, I don't know, like, I don't think this is what I'm supposed to do. I think I'm supposed to go to law school. And now I'm just so relieved because I'm like, oh, she saw it and I just didn't see it yet, that this was going to be a good fit and that I would have skills that would hopefully, you know, be successful in a graduate program.
Yeah, it is kind of, you know, when you see somebody's vita or you read their bio, it typically does seem like a very rational, linear progression. Yeah. And it's always fun to learn the various twists and turns that have occurred along the way. Well, yeah. If that's probably 10 years ago when you started that experience, it would have been hard to imagine you doing what you're doing now. And that's, you've done a lot in the 10 years. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, no, if you told me when I was starting Penn State that this is where it would be, I thought I'd go to law school, I would practice, and then I would maybe come back to be a professor later on. My grandfather was a professor, and he passed away when I was really little, but I grew up hearing lots of stories about him because of that. He was a professor of sociology, and so I always thought like, oh, it'd be neat to be a professor eventually after I practice and I have hopefully success in that arena. And so, yeah, I could have never imagined that 10 years after, you know, being in her seminar that I would be flipped to the other side.
Was it a difficult decision to go academics versus applied? I mean, it's my understanding that even the best programs in the country, it's roughly 50-50 in terms of the route that people go. You always knew?
I always knew. Yeah, it was immediate. I remember just I feel like it's funny how you get like these flashbulbs of these conversations you had and you just distinctly remember, like I remember being in Jim's office fall of my first semester, it was maybe like September, October, and I remember him saying like, are you certain this is what you want? Like you want to go academic, this is what you want to do? And it was just like zero hesitation. I was like, yep, that's it. Like I have no desire to be a consultant. I tried an internship after my first year just to kind of test the water and make sure. And there was nothing, there was nothing wrong with it. It wasn't like I had that experience. It's like, oh, this is terrible. I didn't connect with it. I didn't feel as excited or engaged with that process as I did being, in the lab running data or running participants or writing. And so it was a very early decision. And then what was great is that Jim really, I feel like, gave me a lot of early tools to put me up to be successful. And so he really got me involved in projects that we thought had a high likelihood of leading to publication down the road. And he really just gave me a very, very long rope and kind of let me get out there, try things early, try to get used to the publication process, of the research process, of failing at the research process. He let me do all of it just to get me used to it. Since, being on this other side can be kind of exhausting and crushing sometimes. And he wanted me to kind of build up that resilience early.
You need to know it early.
Yeah. And I'm so thankful for that because I feel like I just didn't, we always laugh because we remember, so my master's project was my first publication at JAP, and I remember getting the R&R letter and running into his office and being so upset, being like, they gave us this R&R, but I think they hate the paper. And he looked at it, he's like, no, like this is good, like we can work with this. I just had no idea what the feedback was like or what it was going to look like. And he was just wildly wonderful at making sure I saw every part of the process, that I was doing the work, that I was working for it and getting through it and learning how to analyze and respond to analysis questions and feel comfortable talking about that versus just, saying, I'll just fix it and it'll be fine.
Yeah, yeah. I had an identical experience with my master's thesis and got rejected at JAP the first time, and I was so discouraged and went in to talk to my advisor. He read the letter and says, "No, this is great. This is really, you know." Anyhow, so you, as I mentioned in the previous comments, you have moved into having a nice balance of substantive and methods interests. When did those interests in methods topics kind of emerge, and what stimulated that for you?
Yeah, so those interests emerged very early. So like I said, so I had that conversation with Jim, like, are you sure you want to go academic? And I was like, yes. And I remember he mentioned to me something, and this is my first year at Akron. He's like, well, for your master's, I think there's an opportunity that you could work with daily diary data. Have you heard of daily diaries? And he kind of explained to me what they were. And right away I was like, oh, that is really interesting. Like, I like the idea of asking questions where I can understand how different experiences or events or interactions change people's affect and behavioral trajectories day to day. That's cool to me. And it clicked very early. And I remember so this is like when I was in Andy Snell's, basic, what is a correlation, like early stats class. He handed me this guy, Burke and Rodenbush, hierarchical linear model. Like, he handed me his copy. He's like, you're going to need to read this then. And I was just like, I'm going to need to do what? I had it. So, my friends and my peers were like, we were all in our basic regression class dealing with that. I was going through Jim's copy of this book. And I remember just being so fascinated because it had all of his little tabs in it, his highlighting, his notes. It was this really cool experience of being like, oh, this is how he thinks about this. And so right away I became very interested in within-person methods. My first summer, we collected experience sampling data, old school with Palm Pilots. So we were like programming Palm Pilots. I can still like hear the sound those used to make with that darn PMAT software to like ping people. And that just kind of kept spiraling, where I kept being like, this is how I think about questions. The running joke around here is like, I struggle with basic regression, but I'm really good at multi-level path analysis because my brain just thinks about data and interpreting it multi-level because of these early experiences. And so then I think once I graduated, that's really when I thought, maybe there's an opportunity that I could start writing papers about my experiences with methods, because at that point I had started developing continuous rating assessment software with Jim. I saw some cool synergies with how that might compare and contrast with experience sampling. And so that was our first ORM publication. It was around that time that I was also starting to get really fascinated by latent profile analysis and how that could answer questions differently. That led to the second ORM. So to me, it was never like, oh, I'm pivoting and writing methods papers. It was like, oh, I'm just writing papers about what I'm doing in this other research area. And I want to kind of help people as much as I can understand how I'm asking questions this way.
So it sounds like you had a great mentor and supportive experience there. And I'm sure that your faculty at Akron tried to do the best they could at shaping an accurate view of what it was going to be like to be a professor. And I felt the same way, but yet I found that when I became a professor and got on the other side, things were just different. Some things were different. So how is being a faculty member different than what you thought it would be as you were thinking about making that transition?
Yeah, it's funny. I think in a lot of ways, being here at Arizona is exactly what I thought, like I always wanted and what it would be. Like I wanted to be at a big public school. I wanted to be kind of in a, Tucson, I wouldn't say it's a college town. It's a college town with a city supporting it, which is nice. I wanted to be somewhere with a strong PhD program. And so when I got here, I was like, oh, this all gels. This fits the image I had in my head of what this was going to be like. I think, and maybe this is some of this I think is a function of being in a business school. I think one of the things right away that surprised me, particularly when I got to Eller, was the extra types of teaching I would be pulled into or offered or asked to do. So you know, being in an IO program, I was not trained to think about teaching executives. I was not trained about all the different MBA or master's programs. And so I've had to learn how to teach in that platform, particularly in the exec ed platform. I've also had to learn how to manage like when it's okay to say no, because sometimes I get asked to teach something and I'm like, I don't know if I want to talk about that for 4 hours, and I don't know if I am the right person to talk about that. So I think the extra teaching was a bit of a surprise. The traveling was a bit of a surprise too. I find myself traveling way more than I ever thought I would be traveling. And it's often for really cool experiences like CARMA or for conferences or mini workshops, but that's been shocking. But I think the one thing that I just didn't understand, and I call Jim and we laugh about it now because I joke that I just like put him through the ringer. I would be in his office all the time and, you know, asking questions. And especially when I was on the market, I was just all the time in there asking questions. What am I doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? And I think I underestimated the amount of time and energy and like anxiety that I would harbor for my own PhD students. So I just feel, you know, I feel so strongly about my students and like I really adopted them in. And so for me, it has been managing their kind of stress with the process, but then managing my own reactions too, right? Of like, okay, like I'm getting nervous about XYZ, but I want to try to manage that a little bit so they don't realize that I'm kind of panicking with them. And so I think the stress of the PhD advising, I love it. It's my favorite part of my job. But it takes a toll, and it's really, I think it's a function of the fact that the markets, particularly for like micro students, are getting wildly competitive. Not that they weren't before, but it's just like picked up a notch in the last few years. It's unreal. And so I think that's been the biggest thing of me just trying to figure out like, how can I support them in the best way possible, position them in the best way possible, and make sure they're well trained and they're getting the support and the care and the kindness that I was given. And then that's something that I think is just going to be this constant learning curve of how do I keep getting better at this. But, yeah.
Well, one of the other things I mentioned earlier was your success both in publishing substantive research on substantive topics and as well as research methods topics. So do you see any synergy between your work in those two areas that you think about methods and it impacts how you think about substance and vice versa?
Yeah, for sure. I think they're completely interrelated for me. I don't view, Lisa, the methods papers that I've written have come out of issues I've dealt with in the substantive areas. So, you know, the paper, and I'll talk about this a little bit or a lot of it, I guess I should say, my CARMA talk at the end of the month, but the recent experience sampling kind of critical trends considerations paper that we wrote, and that was just amazing. It was with Nathan Pasikoff and Dan Beal and Brent Scott, Smeen Sontag, John Shigakis, and Marcus Butts. Like my dream team of, if I was ever going to write experience sampling paper, like those are the people you want to be writing with about this. And a lot of those questions were harbored out of, hey, we're dealing with this issue in our own research. We're dealing with how do we convince reviewers that there is this theoretical contribution beyond just studying something within person, or how do we overcome issues of common method variance and biases in ESM data when that data is already really burdensome to collect and we're already probably overburdening people with X number of surveys per day. And so for me, I feel like I will experience something in a data collection that we're doing or in the review process, and then that has sparked the idea for a methods paper, and then that methods paper gets to filter back into how I design my next studies. And so it's been this really nice kind of cyclical process for me of writing the methods papers to better understand these issues and try to take a stand where I can, and then letting those practices come back and inform the work I'm doing.
Yeah. I'm also always interested as I get to know people in terms of what types of books or classic articles that they read or that influence them. Might I guess that Bryken Raudenbush was one of those, since you have.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of them is sitting right here. I can't. I literally.
That's a behavioral example of data that supports your claim. But are there others that you rely on a lot, or that have impacted you a lot, or that you refer to a lot?
Yeah, so I think what I found particularly with experience sampling, I originally just gravitated towards people who I thought were writing those papers very well. So people like, obviously Jim I thought was writing those papers very well, but like Dan Beal, his like Beal and Weiss 2003 paper was incredibly pivotal for me in understanding controls and how time comes in and what those processes do to experience sampling data. Brent Scott and Sabine Sonntag reading their ESM papers. I think Sabine just uses the method really well to test things across different time periods. And then Brent is a beautiful theorist with how he writes about it. And so for me, that's kind of shaped how I write and approach experience sampling papers. But then there was one other book that I thought was really helpful. It's this, it's a handbook of research methods for studying daily life. I came prepared with props for everybody. And this one was also really helpful in just trying to get better at understanding the historical views of like where this originated from. Why did we create daily methods? Why were these viewed as important transitions away from just normal between person approaches to research? When did we stop thinking about this as error and modeling it as something meaningful when people are changing their scores? And so I think those kind of, looking for great examples in the journals of well-written ESM works, Dan's papers and then these couple of books are probably what I've gone to the most.
Yep. Well, you talked about the how the your own writing influenced your substantive, influenced your methods, and the origin of your ORM paper based on kind of reviewing and dealing with reviewers. And I think that somebody at your stage of career really is kind of in an interesting position to offer perspective, because on the one hand, you've obviously been very successful as an author. You also have a lot of experience as a reviewer, but I guess we would hope that you've not been around so long that you kind of have a cynical view about, this is just the way it is and nothing can change. So I hear a lot of discussions amongst friends and colleagues about all the things that are wrong with the current manuscript review process. And so I just was wondering if you had any thoughts you'd be willing to share about things that could be done to improve the whole system.
Yeah, how to fix the whole system if that happens. Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, I think every time I've put one of my papers through the review process, 99% of the time I look at what results and I'm like, yeah, this is objectively better. This is objectively better in terms of the writing, in terms of the framing. I think my biggest frustration that I've had lately, actually, I don't know how to phrase it. I think it comes down to people maybe getting a little too stuck in their ways of like how they analyze data, if that makes sense. And I'll give you an example. So I love using latent profile analysis because again, it's just how my brain starts to click. I think about how do these variables combine within person to predict outcomes versus how do these outcomes separately work to predict above and beyond the other. And so we've gotten into situations where we will have reviewers who will just kind of be like, yeah, I don't agree or I don't believe you that this is like a valid way. Why not just do regression? We'll then show like, well, here's what happens when you talk about this from a regression-based perspective. And so I think some of the review process has gotten a little more combative where I don't remember who was talking to you about this, but there was a time in the review process where you could kind of have a healthy debate. And eventually you got to the point where you'd be like, well, let's agree to disagree. But you made a convincing argument and I will budge and say like, okay. But I feel like now there's a little bit of, I'm going to dig my heels all the way in and I don't know how to fix that when you feel like you've put through a really good argument. One journal that I think is doing a good job of trying to figure this out, of how to get around like maybe some of these stats issues where people might just be like, no, analyze it this one way. Journal of Management, David Allen was here recently, and he was talking about how every paper there's a stats expert that gets to evaluate and review that paper. Yeah. I think that's really helpful. I think, that we should be honest with, if you've never seen like a latent profile paper before, or a growth curve modeling paper before, maybe we should get somebody on there who can evaluate that component of the work. That way it's not you just saying, yeah, I'm uncomfortable, I don't believe it, I don't buy it. I think that would be a nice improvement. I've also noticed lately, and I don't know if this is just a trend of the field, but it's rare that I'm getting through a review process, whether it's for an experience sampling paper or otherwise, without more data having to come in. Uh-huh. And for experience sampling, that is really difficult because a solid experience sampling study can cost anywhere at the low end. I would say the low end is $5,000. The high end can be close to like 12 to 15 to, we've had one study that ran $18,000 because we had the focal person, their spouse, somebody else come in. And so I'm a little worried about this trend I see of the knee-jerk reaction is we want more data without taking a step back and saying, well, is that really necessary, or would that just be a nice perk? And would that fundamentally change the story you're saying if you brought more data in? But yeah, so those are maybe two things that I've noticed that I'm like, I don't know how to grapple with this. And maybe, I think JOM's going in a good direction of let's get some stats experts and some people who are close to the methods to evaluate just that portion objectively and see what's going on. I think that would be good to see other journals going ahead and taking that lead.
Yeah. This is the kind of the cause of that has united a lot of us about ways that we can improve the quality of the training that the reviewers have. Mm-hmm. So, we started on a project with PsyOp last summer. Kind of an introduction to reviewer training, and we have a really exciting project that's being done with CARMA and ORM, to where we have people we call our advanced reviewer development program. Yeah, and that's a step in that direction. But sometimes I think too, that sometimes, at least I found myself, I believe that I grew a lot as a reviewer. You kind of develop a sense of judgment and when to recommend and suggest, and when do you draw a red line. Yes. And I think sometimes I feel like that the younger people are really, because they're the ones that often have this type of expertise, they're the ones that are currently being burdened a lot, and that while they may have that kind of technological expertise, they may not kind of have an experience base that informs them in a way that would lead them to say, well, a second data set would be great, but that's different than making it a requirement.
Yeah, and that was, the ORM I'm going to talk about in Lincoln, a lot of those comments when we were coming up with, well, what are the questions we would want to address? Some of it was to inform the review process about experience sampling. Like there's this whole issue of, a common reviewer comment in experience sampling studies that the 7 of us collectively had experienced was, all this data came from the same source. That's bad. And we were all kind of like, but is that bad? It was separated across multiple time points. And at the core of the questions, we actually were most interested in that person's experience. That's why it's experience sampling methods. We want to understand that person's lived experience. And so we have a question in there where John Trigakis and I kind of unpack with where, when is secondary data actually needed? Is it always needed? Is that always the right? I think that's a knee-jerk reaction we get when we see kind of a between-person study, like, well, why isn't there a second data point? But that critique doesn't always translate. And I wonder if that's some of the issue, too, is that we apply common critiques of other methods to this newer method, which ESM isn't really that new anymore. And they may not be as founded. And so some of the ORM was us kind of saying, like, well, hold on a second. Sometimes it is needed. if your theory is saying, you know, it's all about impact on coworkers or a subordinate or a coworker, yeah, then your theory kind of says you need to understand what that person is seeing. But if it's really about your fluctuations in your identity and how that affects how you interact with your subordinates, your followers, maybe it's not necessary. So like, let's not jump to the extremes there to automatically assume that something is necessary.
Yeah. So, well, in a couple of your questions, you kind of made reference to what you're going to be talking about in your paper. Can you just kind of give us the bigger overview of what you're going to be talking about this time 2 weeks from now?
Yeah. So for folks who saw Dan Beal's talk, I think he said that was last year, right? That Dan came out. Yeah. So he did a great job about kind of, you know, different types of experience sampling studies, how to design them, how to think about like the construction of using that method. And so I would say mine is like maybe the sequel to that. So I'll be doing, of course, a brief overview of, you know, what the basic premises behind experience sampling methods, what are the general types of questions that we're trying to answer. And then I'm going to be diving into kind of what's next. How do we make this a better process in terms of study design, analysis, and implementation? And so what I'll be reviewing is kind of the trajectory of ESM, and I won't give it away, but spoiler alert, it's been startling how much it's been growing, the number of papers we see coming out every year. And then I'm going to be presenting so our ORM and this recent JAP we have collectively have, probably like 10 or 12 questions that are core to understanding the next phase of ESM. I'm picking kind of my favorite 6, and I'm going to be walking people through what I would consider to be really challenging questions that we don't necessarily have all the answers to, but we have ideas of how we can make improvements. So it's, you know, how do we make this science better? And how our choices we're making in terms of the constructs we're studying, how we're designing our studies, the number of anchor points, the number of times we're surveying, how do those affect our results or outcomes in ways that we maybe didn't realize before? So that's really going to be my goal, is kind of challenging people to think, here's what you know right now about ESM, and then here's where we need to go in terms of our understanding to continue to make this better.
Good. All right, just to bring this to a close, so what do you like to do for fun?
What do I like to do for fun? So part of the reason why, you know, my husband Mike and I, we were really excited to move to Tucson is because we are both avid runners and we dabble a little in cycling. So Mike is insane. He's an ultra runner, so he's done like dozens of marathons and 50Ks. I've done 6 marathons. So we're big runners. We like being outdoors, running and cycling. We love hiking, and so that's something you can do year round here in Tucson. So if you can find me here in my office, you will often find me outside somewhere, running or just being outdoors, because why not when it's 80 degrees and it's early March? So we do that a lot. I'm also a big like musical theater nerd, and so we like seeing shows and things like that come through Tucson. And just kind of spending time. My family just moved to Tucson, and so that's been a nice treat of just getting to spend time with my parents and my family, and I can get to show them the city and things like that. But yeah, outside a lot, trying to clear my head and enjoy being here and not being just holed up in my office all the time.
Well, you got a great location for doing that.
Yeah.
Last question, is there one thing about yourself that you think that others that don't know you might be surprised to find out?
I don't know. So I saw you were going to ask this question. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I'm boring. I also think so I used to write the academics forum column for SciOp, and I overshared wildly in that process. So I'm like, I'm pretty sure if anybody read that, they'd be like, no, we know everything at this point, because I was just like pontificating for 2-3 years about everything. What would people be surprised to know about me? I think a funny story that maybe people don't know was that when we made the move from Virginia to Tucson, so we're big animal people. We currently have a little blind Pomeranian Chihuahua mix named Chalupa, and then we have acquired 5 cats, which is a lot of cats, I'm aware. I don't need comments on that. But when we were in Richmond, we had Chalupa and we had 3 cats at the time. And so we had to figure out my move coming out here was very short. I accepted this job in April, so we had very little time to react. And so we're like, how are we going to get our zoo of animals across the country intact. And the only thing we could come up with that made any sense was we rented an RV and we road tripped across the country with our dog and our 3 cats. We had a hashtag. It was a total scene. And it was like, if people ever see me at Snap and want to see pictures, I have them, because it was hilarious, because our cats, after the first day, were just like, oh, I guess we live here now. And they would like ride on the dashboard. They would like sit next to Mike while he was driving. And we thought it was going to be a disaster. And it ended up being like the most fun 3 days we've ever had, because we got to drive through and see, you know, the whole middle cross of the country that we hadn't really seen too much of. And then just have this really funny experience that we got to like share with people as we were going. So I don't know if that's an unusual fact, but I think it's just a funny story that I like sharing.
It's a fun story, and
Yeah.
if anybody has traveled across country or traveled anywhere with pets in the car, it's easy to imagine how fun that could be. So, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us today some of your reactions, and we're very excited to be hosting in 2 weeks. And so, Allison Gabriel, University of Arizona, thank you so much, and we'll see you in Lincoln in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. I'll see you soon.
Okay, enjoy your day.
Okay, you too. All right, bye.